Yo, thanks, Doobie, for the opportunity to speak. Anyways, Martin, are you there, bro?
Yeah.
All right, I have a quick question before I actually get into some serious questions because I've actually been curious. I did read your background bio, so I'm sure you've been tested throughout your life. What's your IQ?
I got tested when I was in prison. That's the only real IQ test I've ever taken with a real neuropsychiatrist. I got a 138. Um,
Okay, not bad.
it's
Good.
yeah, but
All
being
right,
tested in
perfect.
prison was was a tricky endeavor.
All right. So honestly, the trauma might have even lowered your score, so you actually might be closer to 140 something.
Who knows? Yeah,
Um,
it's not something
yeah.
I
So
care too much about.
basically, look, I feel like we've touched a lot of the pharmaceutical things and like the prison thing. I'm more interested in terms of your overall perspective, having seen, two different worlds. You saw the wealthiest, the most powerful class in America, right? And you've also seen like the regular schmegular Joe. I'm curious, do you think like the ruling class or the elites are selling out the nation to foreign entities, whether it be China, whether it be multinational corporations? What's your opinion on that?
I'd say no, at least intentionally. Maybe unintentionally, possibly. I don't know about that. But in terms of like some cabal sitting around and saying, let's do this or that, I don't think you see that. But I do think like, it's funny. I had a recent conversation with a very prominent, everybody would know the name, venture capitalist, and he said, I care that in your company that there aren't any Chinese investors. I want there to be only American investors. And I thought that was really weird because I never heard that once in my career. And I think this person has been seeing more and more Chinese investors investing in American startups and trying to sort of be aware in them, or aware of them and sort of tracking them and being a part of them, which I don't think is a bad thing. I mean, I don't think that's wrong at all. If I were Chinese investor, I'd be trying to track Chinese companies and American companies, and there are plenty of American investors who track Chinese companies really carefully. So to me, there's nothing wrong with that. And I'm not a globalist or whatever, but like I'm not a nationalist, and I don't believe that we're at this like really weird state and where we're at sort of this in this cold war with China that could become a hot war, and that we should really guard our national interests. And maybe I'm naive and stupid, and that I'll be eating my words soon. But I really don't get that sense, and I certainly don't know of any weird secret cabal where people are meeting and talking about this kind of stuff. Those
Yeah.
conspiracies make
So
me laugh.
here's one an example. Like obviously are you familiar with like the semiconductor industry by any
Yeah,
chance?
yeah, sure,
Like loosely familiar. So like
very.
there's this hot button issue, right? Which is what if the Chinese CCP invades Taiwan, right? I'm of the perspective, what do you think we should do, right? If you have any perspective, do you feel like
Yeah.
um, our home economy corporations are way too invested in this that it wouldn't be worth really seeking out conflict, or is it more so, hey, it's the principle of like we need to be number one, so we ought to fucking maintain that.
Well, we don't have to be number one or number anything, right? I mean, I think that's the good news. I think the bad news, though, is this is sort of traditional business in the first place, right? If you have any single dominant supplier of an important good, and this is not the first time this has happened, obviously, you have to ask yourself these questions. And semiconductors are really important, but we still can make semiconductors without Taiwan Semi. They're the biggest producer, but the world won't stop because of Taiwan Semi stopping. And I think the bigger concern actually is APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, which are mostly made in India and China. Again, not in America. And you have to ask yourself, like, at what point does it become national security risk if all of our medicine is made overseas? That sounds like a serious risk, and it is.
Do you think that's deliberate on the
No,
Chinese
no,
perspective, and like that we're not necessarily paying attention to that?
it was mostly an Indian thing, to be honest. For a long time, China's recently gotten some market share, but it's really just kind of like these are relatively low end goods that are easier to, at least the active pharmaceutical ingredient part of it. They're pretty low end goods. They're basically just chemicals, And China's done pretty well in chemicals in general because they have great chemistry students, and so does India, obviously. And they're much cheaper than American chemists, and it ends up being worth it. And that happens a lot with electronics. It happens a lot with textiles. It happens a lot with kind of these low end things that you don't need to worry about, and you just sort of trust this stuff. But they end up being really important. They're far more important than iPhones and things like that. And so I don't think it's some nefarious plot. I just think it's China's booming economy, or was once booming at least, taking advantage of and India's taking advantage of relative cost of labor and making a good profit. And it's made plenty of Indian billionaires, plenty of Chinese billionaires, and that's a good thing, right? That's the whole point of economies of scale, and that's the whole point of like relative advantages of production and things like that. Now, we do know also though that wars do happen, right? So when wars happen,
Yeah.
you have this, and India is no exception from a country that could go to war, and that you have to be careful of those supply chain choke points, and that again applies to everything: food, energy, agriculture. We see the folly of Europe's energy problems right now, right? So I think ultimately, like, this is not a new thing, and we just have to sort of have some diversification, and I think that comes with kind of what that investor I was talking about earlier is talking about, which is like, okay, should we be willing, say as an American company, say you're Eli Lilly or Merck, should you be willing to buy a certain percentage of your APIs from an American supplier, even though it costs more than a Indian or Chinese supplier? And I think the answer is, there's never anything wrong with a little diversity in terms of supply chain or in terms of
Is it kind of a hedge? Which so let me
yeah.
ask you a question because this is actually a really good point. Um, I'm of the perspective that like whoever that investor was, right, whoever the VC was, that he, unless it's one of the ones who has historically said this, I think it's more so seasonal, right? It's
Yeah,
like, oh, the weather is cold, so I'm telling people to wear a jacket. But when
this
the
is a
weather
Trump.
is warm, I'm not going to be packing a jacket. I'm just going to be like, going shirtless, which is what I think will the market will kind of readjust in 5 years. My question is, what would you have done? Like personally, would you have actually shifted your manufacturing somewhat to America for like a wonder fucking what if solution, or would you have just maximized your profit right then and there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and just in this, I think you're actually right in terms of the weather blowing. In this case, it is one of Trump's closest advisors and backers, but in terms of me personally, I think like most people, the profit motive is too great. If I noticed, let's say I was an API maker, which I'm not, I've never made APIs, I've only bought them. If I was an API maker and I got the sense that Merck and Pfizer and Johnson and those companies wanted American-made API, then sure, I'd be proud to make a new API plant in New Jersey or New York or somewhere, and say, okay, this API plant is open, and if you want to support America, then buy your API from America, and if that works, great, But I think that most of the buyers don't give a shit, and they're price sensitive, and
Yeah.
if I got that sense though, absolutely, it'd be great. It's a lot easier to manage a plant in New Brunswick, New Jersey, than in Hyderabad, India. Uh, I've started learning, a little bit of Hindi. It's so important out there, and I don't want to learn Hindi or Mandarin. I mean, it's much easier to deal with Americans, and you have a little bit of nationalist pride. But for me, for business, I mean, it's profit is really important, and customers, will shut you out and say no. We'd rather have the pills that are or the chemicals that's $1,000 a kilo instead of $2,000 a kilo. That's an easy call for them to make. They don't care where it comes from. And the
So
truth is, it
and I
kind of
want to
comes
take
from
some
everywhere
I
anyway, because
know.
the starting materials might come from Luxembourg.
Yeah. And so I really want to focus this for like maybe the last question because I don't know how long this has been. Um, which is I genuinely believe you when you say that. I think that's also the case for most industries and most business people. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? To kind of obviously say we're individual firms, we're individuals, we need to seek our individual profits. Do you essentially think that's a major vulnerability for America, though, even though it's one of the most beautiful parts, which is a nation like China or a nation like Russia can say, hey, these individuals are going to take care of themselves. And basically, if we find a way to exploit this, we can have some leverage over their business and eventually their politics and eventually their people.
Yeah, I could see where you're coming from, and I do think that's a little concerning. But it's also like, that's one of the like, it reminds me of the old game Civilization, which I really enjoyed as a kid and even as an adult. Like, there is something to be said for, if we get all our stuff from there, then that is something we have over them, and typically that's not something that
Yeah.
we have to worry about because they never have other resources above us. But now you finally have China sort of looking like equal to the U.S. possibly, and that's naturally kind of worrisome for some people, especially kind of the more hawkish type people. I sort of, again, I'm a little naive here, where I'm thinking, well, at the end of the day, it's not such a bad thing that there are two superpowers, and maybe, I don't see China as this belligerent, kind of like reckless country, but you also could have said the same about Russia until recently.
Yeah.
So it's not easy, right? I mean, the other solutions aren't pretty. Like, for example, we can put an excise tax on everything, or we can force people to use domestic, manufacturing, and all that stuff leads to is economic troubles. It generally doesn't work. Protectionism generally doesn't work, but again, maybe in certain circumstances, it could make sense for strategically important.
Would you feel comfortable? So, as a businessman, like, would you be okay with where China was like basically the most powerful country, America was like number two, but like the rules of the game are basically the same, and maybe you have even more access to the markets. Like, would that be something that you would be against solely because like the national position has reduced, but potentially your individual position along with your colleagues could also be elevated?
I don't think it matters, because at the end of the day, like, we have the most successful pharmaceutical industry in the world by far, but China's got other industries where it's number one, and you just have to sort of grin and bear it, right? I mean, each country has its own strategic advantages, and its companies sometimes. For example, we dominate sort of internet companies, but we don't dominate necessarily in other chip making, or I shouldn't say other chip making, other technologies. Where Japan certainly has an advantage in some of them, and China has an advantage in others, and and so forth. So ultimately, each industry is unique, and I don't think our country should be in the business of saying we have to be number one in X, Y, or Z, unless it's a national security thing. And obviously, we have a pretty strong defense industry. So, maybe we should extend that a little bit to some other industries. I don't know. We certainly seem to be doing it with semiconductors. But I for one don't really understand it. I think graphics processors are pretty good for running video games, but I'm not sure what else they're really that
Yeah.
valuable for.
Last quick question before I get muted. How much money is currently in your savings? Like, how much money do you have, man? Like, be honest. Because
That's
I
I'll,
heard you're
I'll be
still
honest
rich,
with
but
you
I want to
that
know.
it's a very personal question, and that you can
How about
honestly not
checkings?
honestly I'm gonna not answer it.
All right, no worries, man. I
That's
appreciate it.
reasonable.
Thanks for your time.